All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up our presentation for Chapter 24 video lecture. Now we're going to wrap up with, again, we're looking at the Americas one last time, and we're going to do a little bit of a comparison between North America and the United States specifically, and Latin America. So, of course, with the mass migrations that we see in the late 1800s, we're going to see the United States kind of create this melting pot, right? And it's going to be very culturally diverse. We're going to have a whole bunch of different people from a whole bunch of different places living in the same country. And what we see with the arrival of these mass of migrants, we're going to see the creation of ethnic communities. Sometimes we call those enclaves. So like in the major cities, you're going to see places like Chinatown and Little Italy and whatever local community an ethnic minority might want to live in. And that kind of becomes kind of like the normal human pattern in where, like, when you migrate to somewhere new, you're going to try to find people who are similar to you, speak their same language, follow your same religion, that sort of stuff. So these ethnic communities are going to grow in size as more and more migrants come in. And for the most part, in American history, we see, and in world history actually, we see that whenever a new wave of migrants show up, they're going to be facing quite a bit of persecution, because they're going to be viewed as outsiders, as foreigners, as strange, right? They have different customs, they have a different language, they eat different foods, and therefore they're not one of us. So we see this occur throughout the 1800s, wave after wave of immigrants coming in. So, for example, when the Irish are showing up in the mid-1800s, the Americans are saying that the Irish are weird, that the Irish practices weird religion called Catholicism, that the Irish eat a lot of weird food. Then by the late 1800s, we see that the Irish, who have by then kind of melted into the rest of American society, they and everyone else is going to resist the arrivals of, say, Italians, and say that the Italians speak weird, and the Italians have a weird language, and a weird food, and weird this, and weird that. So it kind of becomes a kind of a standard or a repetitive situation where the arrival of new immigrants is met with some resistance. We see this as specifically against Asians, or kind of more specific, more extreme versions against Asians, because more than anything else, the Asians don't look white, and therefore they're easier to pick up differences on. So we see that the arrival of Chinese and Japanese migrants to factories, to railroad construction job sites, is going to lead to a lot of native resistance, right? And their complaint, the native people of the United States are going to complain that these immigrants are taking their jobs, that these immigrants are driving down prices, or wages, I should say, because these immigrants are willing to work for less money because they're just looking for any type of job. And so we see a lot of pushback against the arrival of these Asian immigrants, specifically in the western half of the United States. So eventually we see the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and here we see some of the political cartoons of that era trying to kick out or stop the arrival of Chinese immigrants. Right, they put like a limit. So if you were to synthesize this, right, it's kind of like the reactions and attitudes Americans had against Chinese immigrants in the late 1800s is very much similar to what many Americans have nowadays against Mexicans and other Central and South Americans in the 21st century. And you notice the depictions of the Chinese. Look at their haircut, right? You should identify that this is the type of haircut, the Q-style haircut. That was the mandatory type of haircut during the Qing dynasty, and therefore that's how we see that depiction. So the Chinese are going to be excluded from migrating to the United States, similar to how the Australians are going to set up their laws to stop against further Chinese immigration. We're going to see that the Native Americans, once they have been formally conquered, and the resistance are put down, thanks to machine guns and stuff, we see a wave of missionary work to try to convert them. We see a lot of people are going to be assimilating, meaning that they're going to westernize these Native American tribes, sometimes at forcing kids to go to Western schools or relocating them from their parents, so that the parents have no say in the upbringing of their children. We see a lot of forced assimilation, right? Forcing them to adopt these Western values, Western culture, and kind of like let go of their traditional ways of living. So it is, that did occur here in the United States. Slavery, of course, ends, but that doesn't mean an end to social discrimination, because that's going to continue. Segregation is going to become pretty much a legal policy in the United States, all the way into the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. And of course, we see a lot of violence, and we see a lot of terrorism with the KKK, and forcing the sharecroppers, forcing the slaves to work as sharecroppers. We can do another synthesis with the same thing that happens in Russia, right? The serfs in Russia are freed around the same time that the slaves in America are freed, but because they lacked education, they lacked opportunities, they were forced to work for minimum wage and earn barely nothing, and therefore their living conditions really didn't improve even after they were freed from slavery or from serfdom. So segregation is going to continue. Slavery officially ends, but not much is going to improve. Women, of course, are going to start fighting for rights. They're going to start organizing. One of the famous meetings is called the Seneca Falls Convention, where they sit down and declare that women have certain equal rights, and they're going to argue for those rights, including the right of suffrage. Suffrage means, of course, the right to vote. And even though women are not going to gain these rights until the early 20th century, their struggle begins during this era. And one of the reasons that allows more and more women to fight for equality and equal rights is education, because as education opens up to women, more and more women become educated and begin to have more opportunities than ever before. Now, Latin America is going to be a bit different. Remember, Latin America is going to have that very complex racial society, that your status depends on your heritage, on your skin color, on your racial tones, and a mix of Indians, natives, Indians, Africans, and Europeans, right? But we're also going to see more and more migration from Asia to the Americas. Chinese, Japanese are going to make their way into South America, Latin America. We're also going to see a big social difference, cultural difference between the rural areas of Latin America and the more urban areas. So one of the famous examples would be Buenos Aires, which is the capital of Argentina. Buenos Aires is this very large, urban, cosmopolitan, very diverse city. And the people living there, many of them were like middle class or wealthy people, and they start viewing themselves as superior to the kind of like the rural people out in the other parts of Argentina, including the gauchos, which is like the name for the cowboy, right? The traditional rural worker. So we do see that there's going to be a cultural divide between the urban elites and the more rural peasants in Latin America. Machismo is going to be a very big, important part of Latin America. Latin American culture, and is going to reinforce a lot of patriarchal customs. So meaning that men have to exhibit certain qualities to prove their manliness, and therefore women, since they can show those qualities, are not going to be given equal rights in any way or form. And we see that there's not going to be like a feminist movement in Latin America, not during this time period. And even though education becomes more common, it's not nowhere near as universal as it would be in North America or in Western Europe. And therefore, women in Latin America are not going to gain any right to vote or any other rights pretty much until the mid-1900s, right, mid-20th century. And even though many women are going to partake in wars and wars of independence and revolutionary wars, like the Mexican Revolution, For the most part, they're not going to benefit from it. All right, last and final thing we're talking about quickly here is global migrations. And we mentioned this over and over and over, but it's one last final time to go over it. So we see population growth occur in Eurasia. We see, with because of the Industrial Revolution and improvements in food supply and improvements in medical care, people are going to live longer, have more kids, and therefore the population growth and economic opportunities elsewhere is going to push and pull migrants out of Eurasia. So Europeans and Chinese and Indians are going to, leave Eurasia and make their way to the Americas. And of course, they're going to be welcomed in the United States because the United States has a growing demand for laborers. Same in South America, we have all this land, but not enough workers. So immigrants are going to have a lot of opportunities there to grow and expand their wealth. Few cases to keep in mind: we have a lot of Chinese making their way to Central and America and the Caribbean. So we see, for example, this book called Chinese Cubans. There are many Chinese people that lived in Cuba, still live in Cuba. We also see Indians. Indians make their way to Guyana. Guyana is one of those little countries north of Brazil in South America. You never hear about them, but because they are extremely poor countries. But there's a lot of Indian people, people from India or Indian ancestry, that live in Guyana or Suriname, which is what its modern name called, and it's because the British people were, pushing and pulling migrant workers from one colony to the next. So these people that moved, sometimes they moved as free laborers, right? So they're migrating, looking for work and getting paid wages. Sometimes they came as indentured servants, where they had to sign that contract for a few years, where they have to work and pay off their passage costs. And this becomes less common because of cheaper costs and transportation thanks to the steamship, but it's still pretty still happen frequently enough that we need to mention it. And Chinese and Indians will probably be the main groups of indentured servants. Slavery, of course, is still going to be occurring in the early 1800s, but by the late 1800s we see the slave trade end, and the slavery, transatlantic slavery, come to an end. We also see, uniquely enough, that the British, of course, are going to send convicts. People convicted of certain crimes are going to be sent to Australia to live there as a punishment and work as laborers there, which is part of their punishment. So here we see this kind of like strange looking map of all the different migrations, right, that are occurring during this time. Notice how a lot of them are going to head to Hawaii, where we see a lot of agricultural workers there, from Japan, from China, from India. We see, of course, massive migrations to Europe, from Europe to the United States or to South America. We see the settler colonies from Europe to like South Africa, or from Europe to Australia and New Zealand, right? We see we still see Africans being migrated, right, and throughout the early 1800s, with slavery still up and running. We still see a lot of migrations of African slaves into South America and the Caribbean. From India, we see people in India going to South Africa or going to the Guianas, right, in southern and northern South America. All right, we talked about the enclaves, we talked about the backlash, so we're not going to go over this again. So just do recall that governments sometimes step up to stop immigration when they feel it's a threat to their economy. And the two famous examples include the Chinese Exclusion Act and the White Australia policy. So here we see a Chinatown, right, one of those enclaves in San Francisco, right, western part of the United States. Here we see a political cartoon. This is, of course, a Chinese person who is, appeared to be an octopus and is strangling, bringing all these negative things like opium and smallpox and cheap labor and bribery and robbery and all these other things. And so you create these, you would create these images to stir up public opinion against immigrants, to make them look bad, so that so more and more people will support these laws and agree with the, banning immigrants from coming in. So this is kind of what we'll call nowadays propaganda, right? To make certain people look bad and cause the rest of society to believe in something. All right, so that's pretty much it for final video. Once again, thank you for watching and listening and learning, and I'll see you next time.